Part 1, The Takeover. It happened on a Tuesday. Not that days of the week meant much in the overworld, the sun rose and set on its own schedule, mobs spawned at night regardless of what anyone had planned, and villagers traded the same items every morning with the same blank expressions. But Steve always thought of it as a Tuesday, because it had that specific Tuesday energy, the kind of day where nothing was supposed to happen and then everything did. He was mining coal 300 blocks underground when the ground shook. Not the usual kind of shaking, not an explosion, not a cave-in, not a creeper doing what creepers did. This was different. Deep and deliberate, like something enormous had just decided to exist in a way it hadn't before. Steve stopped swinging his pickaxe and listened. The torches on the cave walls flickered without any wind. Then the sound came. A three-part wail, low, middle, high, layered on top of each other like three voices screaming at once from somewhere far above. Steve had heard that sound once before, years ago, and had spent a long time trying to forget it. He dropped the coal and ran. By the time he reached the surface, the sky had already changed. It was no longer the clean blue of a normal overworld afternoon. It had turned a deep, sickly gray, the kind of gray that had nothing to do with clouds or weather, the kind that came from something actively draining the light out of the world. In the distance, above the central plains where the largest village in the region stood, three dark shapes floated against the gray sky. 3 skulls. 3 sets of empty eye sockets glowing with blue-white light. The Wither had come back. And this time it had not come alone. Behind the Wither, spreading across the plains in every direction, was an army. Wither skeletons, tall, black-boned, carrying stone swords and moving with the coordinated patience of soldiers who had done this before. They walked into the village without hurrying, without noise, without any of the chaos that usually came with an invasion. They simply occupied. Within an hour the village was surrounded, the gates were sealed, and every villager who had tried to run had been turned back by skeleton patrols on every road. The Wither itself floated above the village center and did something that Steve had never seen any mob do before. It waited. It hovered there, 3 skulls slowly rotating, and it waited while its army settled into position. Then, when everything was exactly where it wanted, the Wither released a pulse of dark energy across the entire region, a wave that traveled outward for thousands of blocks in every direction, passing through stone and wood and water without stopping. Every player and every villager who felt that pulse understood the same thing at the same moment, without being told directly. The overworld now had a ruler. And the ruler had terms. The terms were simple. The Wither would hold the region indefinitely, no trade, no travel, no building, no expansion beyond whatever territory each settlement currently held. The skeletons would enforce the boundaries. Nothing would be destroyed as long as nobody resisted. The overworld would simply be frozen, exactly as it was, under Wither control, until someone met the challenge. The challenge was a football match. Steve learned the details from a villager elder who had received them somehow, perhaps through the pulse itself, perhaps through some older magic that the Wither carried with it from wherever it had come from. 1 match. 11 players on each side. A proper pitch, regulation play, 90 minutes. If the overworld team won, the Wither and its army would leave and never return. If the Wither's team won, the freeze became permanent. No timeline. No renegotiation. The Wither's team was its Wither skeletons. They had been practicing, the elder said, for longer than anyone could calculate. They played with the same cold efficiency they brought to everything else, no emotion, no hesitation, no mistakes. Every player in the region had already heard about this and every player had already reached the same conclusion. Nobody wanted to play. Not because they were cowards, the overworld had no shortage of people willing to fight monsters with swords and bows and bare hands if necessary. But football was different. Football required 11 people moving together, thinking together, trusting each other under pressure. The skeleton team had been built for exactly this. The overworld had no team at all. Steve spent 3 days trying to organize one. He visited every settlement within reach, talked to every capable player he could find, laid out the situation as clearly as possible. He got polite refusals, nervous excuses, and in one case a door closed very firmly in his face. By the end of the third day he had 0 players committed and a growing sense that the overworld was going to be frozen forever, not because it was defeated but because it was too afraid to try. He was sitting on a hillside outside the skeleton perimeter on the evening of the third day, watching the gray sky and thinking about his options, when he heard something unusual coming from the forest to the east. Screaming. Extremely loud, extremely enthusiastic screaming. And underneath it, the unmistakable sound of something being kicked very hard against a tree repeatedly. Part 2, The Arrival. The source of the noise was a teenager. He had appeared in the overworld the same way most unexpected visitors did, through some combination of dimensional accident and extremely bad timing, and he had been in the forest for approximately 4 hours before Steve found him. In those 4 hours he had managed to punch down 6 trees with his bare hands, accidentally set one of them on fire, build a structure that technically qualified as a shelter but would not survive any serious weather, and kick a round stone repeatedly against every surface he could find while making noises that startled every animal within 500 blocks. His name was IShowSpeed. He was from Cincinnati. He had extremely strong opinions about football, Cristiano Ronaldo, and the general unfairness of the universe, all of which he expressed at a volume that suggested he had never been told that indoor voices existed. He was wearing a red tracksuit that had somehow survived the dimensional transit without damage, and he moved through the overworld with the energy of someone who had consumed an amount of sugar that would concern medical professionals. He had no idea what the weather was or what it had done. He had no idea that the overworld was under occupation. He had arrived in the middle of a crisis with 0 context and immediately started treating the environment as a personal football training ground, which Steve found simultaneously irritating and, after 3 days of polite refusals from people who knew exactly what was at stake, quietly impressive. Steve watched him for a while before approaching. Speed was attempting to chip the round stone over a row of bushes with the precision of someone who had spent thousands of hours doing exactly this kind of thing. His technique was unmistakably real. His control was genuine. His enthusiasm was completely uncontainable and showed no signs of running out. When Steve explained the situation, the weather, the occupation, the challenge, the match, the fact that nobody else had agreed to play, Speed's reaction was not fear or hesitation or the careful calculation that Steve had seen on everyone else's face for 3 days. His reaction was immediate, physical, and extremely loud. He wanted to play. He had always wanted to play in a match that actually mattered. He did not care that the opponents were supernatural skeleton soldiers who had been training for an unknowable amount of time. He cared that there was a ball and a pitch and 90 minutes and something real on the line. The only problem was that one player, even a very good one, was not 11. Part 3, Building the Team. They spent a week finding the other 10. It was Speed who made the difference. Steve had approached every settlement with facts and logic and a clear explanation of the stakes, which had produced nothing. Speed approached them with noise and passion and an absolute refusal to accept that anyone genuinely didn't want to play football, which produced results. He was impossible to ignore and exhausting to argue with, and somewhere in his relentless enthusiasm there was something that reminded people why football existed in the first place, not as a tactical exercise but as something that felt like it mattered in a way that was difficult to explain and impossible to fake. One by one they found players. A builder from the northern forests who had grown up kicking stones against walls because there was nothing else to do in the long winters. 2 brothers from a desert village who had never played organized football but moved with an instinctive coordination that came from years of working together in tight spaces. A young woman from the coast who was fast, genuinely, extraordinarily fast, in a way that had no explanation beyond pure natural ability. An archer who had retired from combat and hadn't found anything to replace it until now. 5 others, each with something specific, each with a reason that went beyond the occupation and the weather and the terms of the challenge. Steve played too. He had never thought of himself as a footballer, but he was strong and disciplined and impossible to move when he decided not to be moved, which made him exactly what a defense needed at its foundation. Speed played as if he had been waiting his entire life for a pitch with actual consequences. They had 6 days to prepare before the match. The weather had set the date itself, another part of the terms that had arrived through the pulse, precise and non-negotiable. 6 days was not enough time to build a real team from scratch. It was barely enough time to learn each other's names and establish which direction everyone was supposed to run. But 6 days was what they had, so 6 days was what they used. Speed ran the sessions with an intensity that surprised everyone including Steve. Away from the noise and the enthusiasm and the constant commentary, there was something underneath, a real understanding of the game, a tactical intelligence that he expressed through demonstration rather than explanation, showing people where to be and when to move by doing it himself at full speed until they understood. He was not patient in the conventional sense, but he was relentless in a way that produced the same result. Nobody left a session not knowing what was expected of them. By the 5th day they were moving like something that was beginning to resemble a team. Not a polished one. Not one that would have impressed anyone with experience. But one that believed in what it was doing, which Steve had come to understand was the thing that mattered most when everything else was equal. On the 6th day they rested. Speed spent most of it alone on the hillside overlooking the skeleton perimeter, watching the gray sky and the floating wither above the village, not making any noise at all. It was the quietest Steve had ever seen him. It lasted about 40 minutes before he stood up, said something under his breath that Steve couldn't hear, and went to find something to eat. Part 4, The Match. The wither chose the pitch itself, a flat expanse of end stone that its skeletons had cleared and marked out overnight in the center of the occupied plains. The goals were obsidian frames, solid and permanent. The lines were carved into the stone. The ball was a perfect sphere of packed ice, dense and heavy and completely unlike anything the Overworld team had trained with. Every villager who could see the pitch from their windows was watching. The ones who couldn't had found rooftops, or climbed trees at the edge of the perimeter, or pressed against the skeleton boundary lines as close as the guards would allow. The gray sky pressed down over all of it and the wither floated at the center of one end of the pitch, 3 skulls rotating slowly, watching with the patient attention of something that had already decided how this would end. The skeleton team walked onto the pitch in formation. 11 figures, black bones against the pale end stone, moving in perfect unison without any signal between them. They took their positions with mechanical precision. None of them looked at the Overworld team. None of them acknowledged the crowd. They simply existed in their positions and waited, completely still, like a machine that hadn't been switched on yet. The Overworld team walked out behind them. Speed walked at the front. He was still wearing the red tracksuit. He had refused every piece of armor or alternative clothing that anyone had offered him on the grounds that he played better in what he knew, which was an argument that nobody had a good counter to. He walked onto the pitch looking at the skeleton team, then at the wither, then at the crowd behind the perimeter, and something in his expression settled into a focus that was completely different from the noise and movement of the past 6 days. Quieter. More concentrated. Like the enthusiasm had been compressed into something denser and more dangerous. The match started. The first 15 minutes were brutal. The skeletons played exactly as advertised, cold, efficient, perfectly coordinated, without a single wasted movement. They kept possession with an ease that made it look effortless, passing in short precise sequences that the Overworld team couldn't intercept because every pass was exactly one step ahead of where anyone could reach. They didn't attack immediately. They moved the ball around the Overworld half methodically, testing the shape, looking for the gap they wanted rather than taking the first opportunity that appeared. The gap appeared in the 16th minute. A skeleton on the left side received the ball in space, cut inside with one touch, and hit a shot from 20 meters that went in off the inside of the post before anyone could react. 1-0. Speed's reaction was not visible to anyone watching from the perimeter. From a distance it looked like he simply reset, jogged back to the center circle, and waited for the restart. Up close, which Steve was, his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was having a very intense internal conversation with himself that would not be resolved until he did something about the scoreline. The Overworld team found their first foothold in the 23rd minute. The fast player from the coast, who had been largely anonymous in the first 20 minutes, deliberately staying wide and unthreatening, suddenly received a long pass from Steve and ran. She was faster than the skeleton, tracking her by enough margin that there was nothing it could do. She cut inside at the last moment and squared the ball across the face of goal where Speed arrived at exactly the right time and hit it first time into the top corner. 1-1. The noise from the crowd behind the perimeter was something that Steve had never heard before and suspected the Overworld had never produced before, thousands of people who had been silent for days suddenly finding a sound they hadn't known they were holding. The skeletons did not react. They reset, restarted, and went back to what they did. Patient. Relentless. The next 15 minutes were the hardest of the match. The skeletons responded to the equalizer not with panic but with increased precision, tightening their passing sequences, reducing the space, making the Overworld team work harder for every touch. They scored again in the 38th minute from a set piece that was rehearsed to a level of perfection that no human team could have achieved, every skeleton in exactly the right position, the delivery perfectly weighted, the finish inevitable. 2-1 at halftime. Part 5, the second half. Steve had never given a team talk before. He wasn't sure he was giving one now. He stood in front of 10 people and said what was true, that they were 1 goal down against a team that had been built specifically for this moment, that the skeletons were better technically, that the match would probably be decided by something other than technique, and that the something had been on display in the 23rd minute when Speed arrived at exactly the right time for exactly the right reason. Speed said nothing during the halftime break. He sat slightly apart from the rest of the team, elbows on knees, staring at the end stone between his feet. He stayed like that until Steve finished talking, and then he stood up and walked back onto the pitch first, not looking back to see if anyone followed. Everyone followed. The second half began differently. The Overworld team pressed higher, earlier, with more aggression than they had shown in the first half, accepting the risk that came with it, accepting that the skeletons might find space in behind and score a third that would make everything impossible. It was a choice between a slow loss and a fast one, and Speed had made clear through 45 minutes of body language that slow was not acceptable. The pressure created chances. Small ones at first, a miscontrol forced by a high press, a skeleton hesitating for the first time when 2 Overworld players closed simultaneously. The hesitation was tiny, almost invisible. But it was there, and it meant that somewhere in the skeleton coordination something had encountered a situation it hadn't fully rehearsed. The equalizer came in the 67th minute. A turnover in the skeleton half, 2 quick passes, and then Speed with the ball at his feet and 1 defender between him and the goalkeeper. What he did with the ball in the next 3 seconds was something that the crowd behind the perimeter would describe differently depending on who was asked: a step over, a body feint, a moment where the skeleton committed to a direction and Speed was already somewhere else. The finish was low and precise, and the goalkeeper had already moved the wrong way before the ball was struck. 2-2. The Wither, floating above the far end of the pitch, rotated all 3 skulls simultaneously toward the center of the field. It was the first movement it had made since the match began that wasn't part of its baseline hovering. Steve noticed it from his position in defense and felt something that he recognized after a moment as important: the Wither had not expected this. The last 20 minutes were played at a pace that nobody had anticipated at the start. Both teams pushed for the winner. The skeletons abandoned their patient possession game and began playing more directly, more urgently, with a different kind of pressure that suggested something in their programming had shifted from inevitable victory to contested outcome. The Overworld team met them at every point, running distances that should have been impossible after 65 minutes, finding reserves that Steve couldn't explain and didn't try to. The winning goal came in the 88th minute. It came from Steve. A corner from the right, taken by the archer whose delivery was as accurate as anything he had put into a target with a bow. The ball curled to the back post where Steve had positioned himself 3 seconds earlier, reading the trajectory before it was struck. He met it with his head, something he had never done before in any context, and directed it down and across the goal line before any skeleton could react. 3-2. The final 2 minutes were the longest Steve had ever experienced. The skeletons pushed everything forward, abandoning any defensive structure, committing every player to attack with the same cold efficiency they had applied to everything else. Twice the ball came within meters of the Overworld goal. Twice it was cleared by margins that Steve felt rather than measured. When the 90 minutes ended, it was not with a dramatic last-second save or a goal line clearance but with a skeleton receiving the ball in space, looking up, and making a pass to a position where a teammate should have been, and finding, for the first time in the entire match, that the position was empty because the Overworld defense had anticipated it. The ball ran through to Steve. Steve kicked it into the stands. The match was over. Part 6, After. The Wither kept its terms. It descended from its position above the pitch slowly, all three skulls facing the Overworld team, and hovered at eye level for a long moment that Steve would never fully be able to describe. Then it turned and moved toward the occupied village, and as it moved the skeleton army disengaged, patrol by patrol, position by position, withdrawing from every boundary they had held for the past week with the same quiet efficiency they had maintained throughout. Within 2 hours the village gates were open. Within 4 hours the perimeter was clear. By the following morning the only evidence that the occupation had happened at all was the end stone pitch in the center of the plains, which nobody had gotten around to removing yet. The gray sky cleared as the Wither left. The clean blue of a normal Overworld afternoon came back in from the east, moving across the sky like something returning to where it belonged. Speed left 3 days later, through the same dimensional accident that had brought him, a brief purple shimmer in the air at the edge of the forest, a moment of transition, and then he was gone. He left at dawn, before most of the settlements had woken up, with no announcement and no ceremony. Steve walked with him to the edge of the forest and watched him go. The end stone pitch stayed where it was. Nobody removed it because nobody could agree on whether they wanted to. After a while people started using it for other matches, smaller ones, informal ones, with no stakes beyond the game itself. The goals stayed. The lines stayed, carved into the stone, gradually worn by weather and use until they were barely visible but still there if you knew where to look. Steve went back to mining. The sky was blue. The sun moved at its usual pace. Somewhere underground, coal waited to be found, and the work of building things that lasted was exactly what it had always been, slow, quiet, and entirely worth doing.